Hello and welcome. Today we are going to talk a little bit about diversity and inclusion. And what we're really curious about is whether or not a predominantly white institution, they are acting more in the way of performative action or if they are becoming an institutional ally. My name is Danny Yonto and I am here with my co-presenter.
Hi everyone, my name is Joyah Mitchell.
So let's get started.
So several months ago, Professor Yonto and I had a conversation about the occurrence of hate crimes on college campuses. One thing we noticed is nearly all types of hate crimes have risen since 2014. We want to know how research looked at hate crimes on college campuses. Several case studies have been conducted on various student populations who experienced campus racial incidents within the last 20 years. What we realized is that aside from Davis and Harris in 2015, few studies have explored the campus's response to such events.
So after classes, Joy and I were coming together and we were thinking about, okay, what is an interesting research question that we want to take into account and look into? And we stumbled upon this. To what extent does Georgia Southern's University's racial incident response align with allyship or performative action? So to get to that answer, what do we know? Well, we know that campus racial climates are on a spectrum. We know that they can be more positive and that they can be more negative. Along the more positive lines, we know that positive campus climates, they are cultivated through several different factors that go beyond numerical representations of people of color. These include more psychological climate, more behavioral dimensions, and a lot more institutional research, policies, and practices. However, we also know that negative campus climates can be created, and these are done through a number of more biased policies and practices, which eventually lead to disparate outcomes for people of color. And the result is that we often see privilege for dominant populations, particularly white faculty, white administrators, and white students. And this institutional racism manifestation, it really does cause some interesting consequences, particularly when it comes with people of color in the Black community among these white spaces. And what we're finding is that white spaces present an increased potential for racially insensitive activity to occur. So what about college campuses? Well, what we know about college campuses is that white spaces typically include something along the lines of fraternity and for a sorority life. And Greek life, well, this is often centered around traditionally white organizations, unless it's specific towards a certain minority.
The occurrence of racial incidents on campus is nothing new, so why is there still a lack of a response? Harper and Hurtado describe this as a powerless paradox. They state, fear of being seen as troublemakers who are always causing attention to racism. Paradox at universities may persist because no policy exists on how to handle racial incidents. The lack of a systemic approach to handling racial incidents is problematic because it results in treating these incidents as isolated and rare rather than pervasive and normal. Even if universities have plans to respond to these cases, they are often left to sit on a shelf and remain unused. This betrays a lack of urgency by the university. So here we can see a trend of racial incidents that have occurred within the last 6 months, ranging from February to April of 2021. It is imperative to analyze the current climate of racism to change this pattern for the future.
And what we're really interested about is going into our theoretical framework here. What are universities doing? And if they're doing something, is this more performative action, and which that would mean in speech, performative actions is to not do what they purport to do, or are they actually doing something about this? Are they becoming an ally? And for this, we are looking at Ahmad's framework that she brought out in 2012. And in order to do this, what we decided to look at was document analysis, and we interviewed Georgia Southern University's administrators. And what we wanted to do was take one incident, one racial incident that occurred in October of 2019 on our campus. And the reason And why we selected this one incident was because this one racial incident ignited campus-wide, national, and international media coverage. And it also occurred while both Joyah and I were on Georgia Southern University's campus. So when we looked at this document analysis, what we wanted to do is ask a few questions. We wanted to ask, do the documented responses present the racial incident as an opportunity for the campus community? We also wanted to know, do the documented responses deny the possibility of racism influencing the racial incidents? And then finally, what we wanted to know is, do the documented responses place the emphasis on future concrete action to be taken with those students involved with the racial incidents? And to look at this, we are heading to Statesboro, Georgia, where Georgia Southern University is present. It is in the southeastern part of Georgia, and it actually is a very nice campus. It has a great college feel to it, and it also is a predominantly white campus. And historically, it's been that, and even today, when we look at the racial component of the population of students, we see that 62% of the students at Georgia Southern are white, with 26% being Black and 5% being Hispanic and Latino, and the rest a mixture of Asian and multi-ethnic groups.
So despite the university having a unique demographic makeup, Georgia Southern has a history of racial incidents. There have been multiple reports of racist commentary from both faculty and students. In the fall of 2018, student and campus leaders at Georgia Southern agreed on one thing: the university needed to do something about campus displays of racism.
And it's interesting how the university tried to make this change. And one of the ways that Dr. Chris Kaplinger decided to do this was use the first year experience class. And this was very interesting because you can get all the incoming freshmen in particular classes, and you can start to have, according to Dr. Kaplinger, a discussion. And the discussion in the fall of 2019 was going to be about diversity and inclusion. So how is this discussion going to be facilitated? Well, in each first year experience class, there was a common textbook. And the common textbook in 2019 was Make Your Home Among Strangers by Janine Capo-Crusette. Now, this is an interesting book because it's a story of a first-generation American born to Cuban immigrant parents. And what the book details is we have the author being accepted into a really elite university, but while she's there, she's also rejected at the same time by her family and her white peers.
The FYE department invited the author to speak at a freshman seminar. Students of all backgrounds, including myself, were in attendance and listened to her speak about her life experiences. Some of the topics she spoke about were white privilege and lack of minority representation in higher education. Her words seemed to resonate with the crowd until things got rowdy during the Q&A session.
Qualified to come to a college camp. I'm not saying you don't have qualifications. That's all I'm
I feel
saying.
like deja vu, right?
Okay, well that's fine.
I think.
Wait, so can I ask my question? Because I would like to finish my question.
You're asking what qualifies me. I can
No,
go back to the page.
I'm not asking you if you're
and
qualified.
read
That's
the-
not what I'm asking. If you would just let me finish the question, I could finish the question. Okay, so I'm asking you, what makes you believe that it's okay to come to a college campus like this when we're supposed to be promoting diversity throughout this campus, which is what we're taught? Baby, I'm not asking you the question. Baby, I just would like to know why you came here to tell all of these people that white people are privileged. I don't really understand what the purpose qualified.
After the seminar, we still see students frustrated. Their frustration led to this.
That's a hard comment. I love it.
Several students gathered to burn the author's book on a grill in the courtyard of my dormitory at the time, Eagle Village. The video started to gain traction online. The author herself commented on the incident several hours after it was posted on social media and expressed disdain towards the students' actions. Overnight, this incident went viral and the story was covered by national and foreign news outlets in Great Britain and Australia.
So this sets up where we are. We see the racial incident occur. And now what we want to know is what's the university's reaction? And to break this down, we're going to look at how the university reacted in the short term and in the more long term. So what happened almost immediately after we saw that book burning? Well, what we see is an email from the university president on October 11th. And inside this email, if you look down to the third paragraph that we highlighted, you start to see how the university is approaching what we just saw. And I quote, "This is the night's events were another example of freedom of expression in a continuing debate of differing ideas." And when we go down to the next sentence, you start to see that, again, it's within the student's First Amendment rights. Book burning does not align with Georgia Southern's values. So immediately, we do not see this pegged as a racial incident. Instead, it's more First Amendment rights. Now, this is interesting because we also start to see a few more reactions by not the university president, but specific departments inside the university. And let's head down to the counseling center first, because this was even before the president sent out his emails. And what we start to see is the counseling center say that it is aware of the events, and it knows it can be traumatizing to the Latinx and Hispanic students and other marginalized communities. So we have some awareness of what's going on, and maybe this a little bit suggesting it's a racial incident, but nothing specifically saying that. And if we head up to the history department, we actually start to see a pretty good stance on this. We see that the history department says that it condemns this behavior in the strongest of terms. But then we looked over to the writing and linguistics department, and we see again, this does not reflect the values of Georgia Southern, and we also regret the experience that the author had. So nothing really saying this is a racial incident and we condemn that racial incident. So there was a big lack of response in the short term about that. And because of this, we start to see that the students were not very satisfied, particularly the Student Government Association. And what we have is a student forum where the president was brought in to address a lot of questions that the students had. And what the students brought up was something very interesting, because the moment this was announced, as you can see here, it was a packed house. And the questions revolved a lot about race. So let's head up to the top question here. One of the questions the students asked was, "I've noticed that a couple of words haven't been said. Does the university believe that the actions that were taken were racist? Does it condemn the racist actions, or do they just condemn the action?" And what you can see is the president's response isn't immediately looking at this and saying, yes, it's racist. It's kind of meanders a little bit until we get down to, "I don't know their heart. I don't know if they are, but the actions themselves are repulsive and symbolic of historic reflection of intolerance and, yes, racism." So this is the first real racist response that we see from the president. And then we head down to the next question by students, and this was, "Do you acknowledge white privilege? And if you do, what do you define it as?" And again, the president meanders through his response, and then towards the end, we start to see, so absolutely yes, I believe it does, referring back to white privilege. And if we look down to the final question that I want to bring to your attention is, "I know you said you will not punish them, the students, but we need to have an action because we can't let this go." And the response by the president was, in essence, the First Amendment overrides student code of conduct. And so that is frustrating.
About a week after the book burning, students held a rally and march across campus to voice their opinions on the recent and previous racial incidents on campus. They marched to the grill where the book burning occurred and used water to douse harmful stereotypes. I had the pleasure of attending this event, and I can honestly say it gave me and other students reassurance that we belonged at Georgia Southern. A year after the book burning, the school newspaper, the Georgian, checked in with students to see how they felt about everything that occurred. The first student states, "I don't think they handled the book burning well because it was a simple inclusion email, and I think things should have been done more than an email," student C stated. "And as far as recent events that happened over the summer with racial things, all we got was an email. I'm sick of getting emails. So I don't think it was handled very well. Besides, all they gave us was an informational session on what is book burning. I don't think that's enough." The second student stated, It's kind of like the university just kind of brushed it aside a little and then kind of went about their business, student A said. So I don't really think it's gotten better. I kind of think it's like, okay, it happened, let it go. And the last student stated, I don't think we were able to see much of an improvement just because COVID-19 happened. So it was kind of a distraction. I don't think they handled it the best. It could have been better, said student D. I don't think people really think about it right now. So it's not like we don't really see much of an improvement right now. All I can say is that it could have been handled better.
And so we're starting to see that in the long term, about a year, year and a half out, there is a growing disconnect between the university and the students. But what has the university done? And is that disconnect valid? What we start to see is that the university has taken some concrete steps. One of the first concrete steps that they took to address this book burning incident was hiring Dr. Wilson, who you see here. And he was Georgia Southern University's first chief diversity officer. And one of the first things that Dr. Wilson did was he created the Inclusive Excellence Action Plan. And what was inside this action plan was a very interesting change to the first year experience class. And what we start to see is that inside this class, and instead of having some informal conversation about a common textbook, there are now 5 new inclusive excellence modules in the first year experience curriculum, very detailed with specific learning outcomes and how to address those learning outcomes. But that's not all the university did. One of the other things the university did that I think is even more interesting is that they have restructured their organization. Now, Dr. Wilson isn't just the chief diversity officer. He's also the associate vice president for inclusive excellence. So we're starting to see Georgia Southern reprioritize diversity and inclusion and give Dr. Wilson a direct line to the president in case there needs to be something done immediately. And so when we talked with Dr. Wilson, one of the things that he really tried to emphasize was that, are we perfect? Absolutely not. But are we committed to doing better? But we are committed to doing better. And that's what I think is really powerful when we look at the energy that Dr. Wilson brings to Georgia Southern University's campus. So how do we assess Georgia Southern University's response? Well, in the short term, we can absolutely say that there was a missed opportunity to denounce this racial incident. Instead of it being categorized as a racial incident, we see that this was identified as a free speech issue. And what that did was it really did drive a wedge in the students. And what that created was a lack of confidence among these university students in seeing that the university could be an ally. But what about the long term? In the long term, we're starting to see a little bit of an evolution. We're having Georgia Southern University now prioritize diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives. We're starting to see that the university is restructuring how it's organized in order to prioritize this through Dr. Wilson. And the problem that we're also starting to see is that there really hasn't been a chance to implement any of these changes because of COVID. So really, what can we say about this all? And that's where we start to try to package all of this together. So when we looked at all these documents, what did we see? Do the documented responses present the racial incident as an opportunity for the campus community? In all that we saw, we can honestly say, no, it did not. Do the documented responses deny the possibility of racism influencing the racial incidents? No, but it doesn't directly acknowledge it. So it's a little bit iffy right there. What about the third one? Do the documented responses place the emphasis on future concrete action to be taken with those students involved in the racial incident? In the short term, absolutely not. And in the long term, well, we really just don't know.
So now we have to ask ourselves, did Georgia Southern do what it said it would do? On the one hand, yes, Georgia Southern has made significant strides to prioritize diversity, equity, and inclusion on campus. On the other hand, it is too soon to tell whether the new initiatives will be successful. If Georgia Southern or any university institution claims to prioritize DE&I, restructuring the university must be the start and not the end of the DE&I journey. It is important to remember diversity and inclusion is a lifetime pursuit. Thank you for listening to our presentation.
And we look forward to any and all of your questions.
Thank you so much. Anybody want to dive in with a couple questions before we switch over to Tony's presentation?
I have a question.
Go ahead, Cara.
You referred to it as racial incidents, but I would say racial and ethnic, because if you look at the census and the way that they categorize different groups, Latinx can be Black or white. So I just would work on your phrasing.
Yeah, I think that's a good observation right there, is how do we more precisely categorize that? So that's something I think is a good thing to
I mean,
have us
you
look
know
on.
that, of course, race is a social construct, not a biological construct. So because there's nothing in our like DNA that can differentiate one group from another. But we operate as though it does exist, right? It's endemic into our systems in our society. So I'm always careful, because I've done some writing on issues of race and ethnicity, to point out that it's a social construct. It's not biologically based, because for so long in our history we believed it was biologically based, and we used like what we would now see as pseudoscience to justify you know, basically our systems. So I would just clarify that as well.
Yeah, thank you.
And I explain it more eloquently than I am right now in a book that I edited with Christine Woischner called Social Studies and Race, in that intro.
Sarah, did you have a question before we need to transition to the next presentation?
I do, I can hold it, but I also saw, I think Tony was unmuting too to speak, so I don't want to jump.
My question is not that serious. You can go ahead, Sarah. Thank you, though.
I just wanted to thank you both. And Joyah, I just want to say thank you. It's intimidating to present. And I really appreciate you being willing to do that in a conference setting. So thank you so much for doing that. And one question that I had, and maybe this would be a second round of research analysis, I don't know, but I was curious with the document analysis, if you had the opportunity to look at any of the, I don't remember the exact thing, but the D&I plan that's in the first year experience, and if that included anything about interrogating whiteness, or if they avoid talking about whiteness at all within that. I know that there's a lot of D&I initiatives that really sidestep whiteness, and that's definitely kind of the root, right, of racism, what's producing it. And so I was just kind of curious if that's something that you've been able to do or would be able to do for like an additional study.
Now that's interesting. One of the things that this plan does is it was a balancing act, I think, politically for the university, because this was a radical change. They've never had a diversity officer before. And so they were really trying to balance what they can do. And that to me is probably the reason why this idea of interrogating whiteness was not in this plan. Because I think that may have been a bit too much for the university maybe to handle, but that's just my suspicion. But that's definitely a big part of it that's missing. So I think that would be an interesting aspect to look back in and ask, how come it's not there? Or how can we maybe bring this into the next diversity and inclusion plan? That would be my take on that. But that's a really good question. Thank you for that.
I'm sure that Tony's presentation will also bring up because they are paired so well in topics. So let's let Tony go ahead and begin presenting so that then we can have some time for Q&A at the end of hers too. But thank you again to Joyah and to Danny for that presentation, and very interesting fodder for future conversations and topics.
Okay, everybody ready? All right, so my name is Antoinette. I'm Tony Rochester, and I was doing this presentation with Dr. Tina L. Hefner, but as you guys know that she's currently under the weather, so let's keep her in our thoughts. But our presentation is Teaching and Learning African American History and Anti-Blackness Education Case Study. So for just terminology purposes, I'm going to be saying African American, and when I say African American, I'm talking about individuals that are descendants of the African slaves that were in the United States. I know Black and African American are used interchangeably, but we're intentionally using African American. Okay, so just a little background on our presentation. This is a continuation of an exploratory study on state policies, state standards, and state development in an adopted textbook on how African American history is represented in official course curriculum. So first, we had identified states that explicitly include African Americans in their state standards, along with the resources such as textbook and other supplementary material to support the inclusion of African American history. Next, we quantified standards and language to create a scale of explicit exclusion within the standards. Following that, we conducted an exploratory study of the states, all 50 states, including Washington, D.C., to determine which states, as well as D.C., that had legislation that required the incorporation of African American history in their school curriculum. And through that exploratory survey, we found that 13 states had legislation that required the inclusion of African American history, starting from various years, starting from as early as 1984 as to late as 2017. Following that, we decided to narrow our scope of research to middle school and selected 8th grade because this is frequently where standards and inclusions are most closely aligned. Next, we developed a crosswalk of the standards and state legislation policies that require the teaching of African American history in the state developed textbook, which then led us to South Carolina. So based off that, we were trying to see, like, do state social studies standards adhere to the language of the state policies regarding African American history? And when African Americans and African American history is taught, how is it addressed within the standards? How are African Americans and African Americans history portrayed in the standards and in the developed textbook? So more specifically, what impacts does this have on students' understanding of African American history? And what role does policy play in the incorporation of African American history and standards and educational related resources? So that was like kind of like our outside research, as I had said, that kind of pushed us into the direction that we went. So Paul Ortiz in 2018, and my African American and Latinx history of the United States, I'm not sure how many of you guys have read that text, but it's an amazing text, stated, as all racial minorities grow, it becomes increasingly important to address the fundamental questions of fairness of African Americans, which affects the fortitude of other groups. So African American history is solely taught when it benefits or is in conjunction with the larger narratives of American history, typically. It's seen as being very whitewashed. History is very Eurocentric, as we all know. Textbooks are the common resources that practitioners use within their classroom instructions, which makes it so vital that we understand how history is being depicted within our resources. So there's limited regulations on how social studies textbooks are developed, and states are kind of allowed to freely develop their own textbook, and we're using the word freely very loosely. There is some form of oversight, but states kind of have a little bit bigger autonomy when they're doing their state developed textbook. So in 2015, Woodson surveyed 19 social studies textbooks and found that the information presented in these textbooks are misleading regarding the representation of African Americans. More specifically, additional research found that when African Americans are taught in textbooks, only Pacific leaders are acknowledged and remembered because these individuals are deemed and viewed as heroes due to their role in achieving racial progression. So our study focused on imagery. So within that, imagery or visual sources can be seen in various aspects. So we're looking at paintings, photographs, cartoon, etc. Within education, specifically social studies, imagery frequently used as a method to support classroom instruction and grant students the opportunity to see historical events and people as they were during that given time period. So while research supports and encourages the use of imagery to broaden students' understanding and assist them in contextualizing events, time periods, and various perspectives, Imagery can also have an adverse effect on students' understanding from the same said vantage point if it's selected in negligence. So now getting onto our study, again, as I had said, it was an exploratory study to investigate how African Americans and African American history, specifically on this one, is visually portrayed in the state developed textbook based off Lorenzi 2017 timeline, which I will go into in a little bit. We selected 8th grade as our focal point of interest. And our research question for this specific paper was, how is African American history visually portrayed in state developed textbooks? We used anti-Blackness education theory, ABET, to analyze how images were used and focusing on the tone and manner. And I'll explain in the next slide what ABET is. So using critical race theory, or CRT, and Black critical theory, Black crit, a hybrid theory called anti-Blackness theory was developed to examine the use of imagery to describe the experiences of African Americans, which in turn is African American history, in a state developed textbook. So within CRT, we used all the 5 tenets. I'll briefly go through those. So first, that white supremacy and whiteness as properties are foundational to US legal practices and the system itself. 2, the notion of colorblindness is counterproductive to achieving racial emancipation and is only removed through the lens of interest convergence, which benefits whites primarily. 3, the deconstruction of racism and a negative impact it has on individuals of color may only be undone through the inclusion of experimental knowledge of all groups. 4, the deconstruction of racism is done through an interdisciplinary approach. And 5, the incorporation of social justice practice and the intentional and pragmatic shall dismantle systematic oppression of historically marginalized groups. So we used all the tenets of CRT, and then within Black critical theory used all those tenets as well, that 1, anti-Blackness is an endemic and essential to how we see, how we sense the social, economic, and historical and cultural demise of human life. Blackness exists in tension of neoliberal multicultural imagination. And lastly, that Black crit creates a space, a Black libertary fantasy, and resists the re-envisioning of history that supports the dangerous stories and disappears whites from the history of racial dominance. So again, we combined all those theories to make anti-Blackness education theory. So Lorenzi 2017 stated that African American history is taught typically in 4 timelines. 1, mid-19th century slavery status and anti-literacy laws. Next, Reconstruction. Following post-Brown versus Board of Education 1954, and today, early mid-20th century. So using his scholarships, images were randomly selected within the social studies textbook in South Carolina. And based on the images, ABET was used as a basis of analysis to evaluate the tone and manner in which African Americans and African American history was visually represented. So now I'll go into how we defined the tone. So using anti-Blackness education theory, we identified 4 themes that connected to the tone or manner. We believe the representation of African American history is within typically shown in history and the experience and standards. So the first one was through oppression, which describes the portrayal of African Americans in subservient and dehumanizing tones. Next was through statehood or identity. It refers to the state being representative as an autonomous enemy. Additionally, the goal and the ideals of the state are embedded in whiteness and white power. Next would be power and struggle and resistance. So first, it refers to the evidence of white resistance to the inclusion of African Americans in the state without explicitly asserting racialized acts. Next, it goes into the missed opportunities for the inclusion of African American history and perspective. And then lastly, the dismissal of civic and civil engagement of African Americans. And lastly, we did it through omission, which is defined by the lack of acknowledgement of the contributions of African Americans, the limited recognition of historical, national, Supreme Court cases that advanced African Americans, and a minimal discussion of African Americans outside of those that are deemed as heroic and seen through other forms of the state. So now we'll start looking at the images. So beginning in the mid-19th century during the slavery status and anti-literacy law. This came from chapter 4, Antebellum South Carolina, lesson 1, Cotton is King. This is a wood engraving of 4 adult African Americans, 3 are male, 1 are a woman, 2 children and 1 white male. And the caption underneath it says that the wood engraving depicts the first cotton gin. The machine immediately skyrocketed cotton production in the South and made South Carolina planters some of the richest in the world. So that was our first image that we were analyzing with ABET. So this is our point of analysis. While the caption aligns with the agricultural interests of the state legislation policy, it completely ignores African Americans and slavery. It presents African-American history from the perspective of planters and the rich people, thus commodifying African-American history to uplift the economic fortitude of the state. This narrative continues the lens of oppression, misrepresents African-Americans, and is a very white-centric American history. The creation of the cotton gin had an immense impact on slavery, so much so that the profitable farmers were able to yield the cotton production increasing rapidly. The economic boom was a result of the innovation and the thought that it made picking cotton easier. Yet what is silenced in the visual portrayal is the effect that it had on the enslaved African Americans, increasing expectation for picking cotton. This omission leads to an interpretation that it is easier as making slavery more enjoyable and less brutal. The wood engraving image of the enslaved African American caption does not acknowledge that African Americans in the images are slaves. Moreover, the pictorial representation of them smiling and appearing joyful while using the cotton gin dismisses and creates a false pretense that enslaved African Americans were happy to be using the cotton gin, happy to be working freely, and happy to be in the conditions that were surrounding the United States. So now looking at more specifically under anti-Blackness education theory, we would argue that this imagery is to be expected. To acknowledge the truth about slavery and the depths that is rooted in American history would require policymakers, textbook developers, and those alike to recognize, one, any imagery showing enslaved people being joyful while working is an inaccurate depiction of it itself. Next, the economic benefit of slavery was only in part of the reason why slavery existed in the South. Race is an important aspect of slavery and is a key component in the racialization of the South. Therefore, ABT would suggest that it is used as a way to push systematic racist ideologies. So within the same time period, we thought it was very interesting that they also had this image for mid-19th century slavery status and anti-literacy laws. So this is from chapter 5, A Nation Divided, lesson 2, The Battlefield. So this is a painting of Massachusetts 54th African-American Volunteer Infantry charging Fort Wagner in South Carolina. So the basis of the analysis, as though this is the same era, it depicts African-Americans very differently. In the painting, we see Massachusetts 54th African-American Voluntary Infantry, which is unique and monumental because it's the first all that we know historically of all African-American Union troops charging Fort Wagner in South Carolina. Within the painting, we see African-Americans charging the shore bank, waving the American flag highly and proud, whereas the opposing sides of the Confederate soldiers raised a Confederate flag while resisting the Union Army's invasion. Underneath the painting, there was a caption that states, Black soldiers from the 54th Massachusetts Voluntary Infantry Regiment stormed Fort Wagner in July 1863. Colonel Robert Goldshaw, the white Union soldier, led the man to battle. What do you think was the artist's view about the Army itself? So under ABET, we would say that this image is deemed successful because it changes the method of which we typically would see African-American experiences during this time era. It presents a different perspective and it shows the resistance African-Americans exhibited fighting for freedom and equality. Moreover, the painting, the history associated with it allows students to evaluate and rethink how they contextualize African-American involvement in the Civil War and their understanding of it. However, it puts into this space of what we deem as what is considered the way of life and self-serving one racial group more than another. And within the painting, it reveals the racial hierarchy within the Union Army. And this can be a way to have open dialogue with your students, trying to debunk theories and racial inequities within the Southern creation. So now we're in the Reconstruction era. So this is an image that came from chapter 7, Expansion and Reform, lesson 2, the Tillman era. And this is a photograph of African-American school children in front of the schoolhouse with their teacher. So to create a holistic narrative, anti-Blackness education theory indicates important to show actual photographs of African-Americans fighting for their advancements through obtaining an education. Because never showing imagery of African-Americans gaining or obtaining education, voting at polls, etc., only encourage a deficit-minded narrative well-documented social studies textbooks. Yet the question posed alongside the photo under ABT is valid, but also problematic. Asking students to form a comparison between the schools and the photographs against others indicates that schools were in better condition, which in turn implies that although schools were segregated due to Jim Crow laws, all segregation was not horrible, meaning although the educational conditions African-American children were experiencing were not equal to white children, it could have been worse depending on your location, which historically we know to be true. But to pose that question, it creates this space of that a contentious discussion of how do we approach discrimination? Are we pacifying it under the practice like things could have been worse? Is it making it seem that although like we should talk about it, we should minimize or trivialize experiences? So next, we are looking at Post-Brown versus Board of Education, 1954. And this is in Chapter 9, The Turbulence and Change, Lesson 2, The Movement of Democracy. This is a photograph of the Friendship 9 activists being arrested for protesting Jim Crow laws in segregated South. So under ABT, it is necessary and needed when teaching African-American history. Likewise, inclusion of the Friendship 9 freedom activists being arrested for refusing to comply to Jim Crow laws shows not only the dark past of the United States and the experiences of African-Americans, but it also highlights the endless desire for change and equality. Yet the question that the author Hicks 2013, posed under it is deemed questionable and asks, like, what is the intent of the question? While it's important for students to contextualize the image and consider the perspectives of it, is an attempt to put them into their shoes. Nonetheless, it makes it seem as if there should be like a limited perspective of the experiences of it under it. I'll go back to the image just so we can see it as like, how is their moods different? What does it tell about each person standing against segregation? And so while it creates a well-rounded knowledge of Jim Crow South and segregation, students are liable to be left with limited perspective of the experience of those arrested when protesting Jim Crow laws. Therefore, again, using anti-Blackness education theory, we support and encourage to incorporate the use of imagery, but acting to students solely about the mood and what each mood implies indicates that there's a difference in opinions of the set experiences. And lastly, so now we're on the earliest 20th century to today. So this image was non-existent, and I'll go on to talk about the analysis of the image that they did use. So the imagery to represent this time period was vastly different and limited. The only visual representation to show African-American history was a photograph of the first African-American Republican senator since 1901 to represent the Deep South. And they made it very clear that he was the first African-American Republican senator to represent the Deep South. Since 1901. Although it's historic and it took over 100 plus years for an African-American Republican candidate to be successfully elected as a senator of the Deep South, the inclusion of his image within this time frame creates a false pretense that racial tension and discourse no longer exists within Southern society. Thus, again, using anti-Blackness education theory, this image was intentionally selected, not to celebrate the accomplishments of said senator being elected, but rather to create a narrative that could deem it hard to dismiss the US as a post-racial society, which then challenges the argument that systematic racism still exists within modern day society. Moreover, anti-Blackness education theory indicates instead of approaching or encouraging racial progression, it only furthers divide because its refusal to acknowledge African-American history. Moreover, systematic racism that is more prevalent, but it's still very much prevalent in our society. So these are just some concluding thoughts. So for the mid-19th century and Reconstruction, the images shown going back to the themes, statehood or economic stability, resistance and omission. Brown versus Board of Education, early 20th century images showed power struggle, resistance and omission. So overall, racism is embedded in American society, particularly within Southern history. When discussing the racial history of the United States, it is vital there be a level of awareness regarding the tone in which it is conveyed. Anti-Blackness education theory indicates the need for education in every aspect of society to create and solidify a space for Blackness to be recognized and accepted more than to be accepted as a part of, not just as a part of the United States' past, but as a present part of our everyday life. Scholarly research, as well as our analysis of the images used within the state developed textbook of South Carolina, showcase that how visuals can either accurately or inaccurately retell and represent history. More importantly, how vital it is for there to be intentionality when it's selecting visual sources to portray history. Imagery allows students the ability to better contextualize and understand the perspectives of the individuals during that given time period. Being that African-American history is a history that is ignored and whitewashed, it becomes very much more prevalent and that much more important that the imagery that is used is done with care and intention. And thank you. And now if there's any questions.
Thank you, Tony. You did a great job. And that's a tough topic. I wondered if you were familiar with LeGarrette King's framework for teaching Black history. I know you used an anti-racist framework, but LeGarrette King, who's a professor at the University of Missouri, came out with a new framework. I want to say it was like December 2020 in social education. Do you know this?
Dr. Hefner says like I'm kind of like obsessed with LeGarrette King because I always cite him in all my stuff. But I'm familiar with it, but I can't think of it at the top of my head. So I'm going to make sure that I go back.
Okay, so what I would recommend is you look at that framework because there's kind of some tenets. I loved what you did with the imagery on slavery. I worked on a book that will be coming out with LeGarrette and a historian, Rob Baker. And so we used this framework, which kind of shifts the mindset from, the happy slave imagery, but he had us think about things like Black joy, Black agency. And so when we were looking for primary sources for the lessons, we were searching specifically to find evidence of that written, by Blacks. I learned there were 188,000 Blacks who fled the South during the Civil War to join the Union Army. I mean, everybody knows the 54th Mass because of the movie, right? But what I hadn't realized was the extent of the formerly enslaved who wanted to help the Union cause, which of course then demonstrates their agency, their assistance in helping to win the war on the Union side, and kind of dispels the myth of the happy Black slave, right? Because if they're so happy in their place, then why the heck are they leaving and wanting to fight on the Union Army? So I really like that kind of, how I had to go at thinking in a different way, right? Rather than the heroic white saviors who won the war. Like, what was the role? And there were other aspects too, like African cultural retention, Black abolitionists. I don't know if you have the anti-slavery writings book. It's Library of America. I really recommend you get it. It's a comprehensive compilation of abolitionist literature, and there were maybe 30 different African Americans who wrote abolitionist literature. Prince Hall, David Walker. I mean, there's a lot.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, as you were talking.
Yeah. No, if you want, I can, I want to actually send you, Tina, I asked to write a recommendation for the book, but we had to make a lot of revisions this spring. So I'm going to send it back to her. I would also like you to look at it.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate it.
Yeah. So great job.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'll echo Kara's appreciation for your presentation. And I was curious if you've had a chance to think about what you all gathered from the presentation and then use that with pre-service teachers and kind of lessons about teaching them how to choose primary sources to maybe challenge those that are in the textbooks. Like if you've kind of made that framework or talked about anti-Blackness education theory in terms of how they can use that as criteria for choosing primary source, visual primary sources.
Thank you so much for that question. We have done other work that has done that, but we haven't used this particular work. So I'll definitely make that suggestion to Dr. Hefner of us kind of doing an expansion and then focusing on pre-service teachers and the resources that they can use to teach African American history. Thank you so much. That's a great suggestion.
I also thought about go ahead, Kelly.
Sorry, I was going to say, as a pre-service teacher, I really appreciated how you didn't just show the image, but you showed the questions that were being asked in the textbook and really dove into how those were problematic. Because I think you mentioned too, they don't, at the surface level, they don't seem problematic, they seem valid. But what is the intention behind asking and what is it really getting at? So I really appreciated that. And I was also wondering, you mentioned the name of a textbook, and I think I missed it earlier in your presentation that you thought was really good. Do you remember the name of it?
Yeah, by Paul Ortiz, African American and Latinx History of the United States.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
I just also was going to say that I went to primary source analysis as far as how powerful it would be to get, I mean, we've all talked about the use of textbooks in social studies education. Presently, you know, as far as being critical of the content, the creators, and all of that sort of thing. And so just having these models of how to analyze the primary sources, these photographs, to be thinking about all of those different elements to contextualize them, you know, that's all part of the primary source analysis process. So I think that having students even critique that, and then having, again, as supplementary materials for teachers for either in-service or pre-service teachers, those models of how those images can be analyzed, especially with the questions to be asked. I think the more, what we've heard from teachers, I think, is the more materials and models and examples we can provide, then the more likely they are to use it, because it all, I think, often comes down to a lack of background knowledge and training on educators' parts from our lack of history growing up and things like that, you know, in this critical analysis. So I think that even the way that you all have analyzed these photographs could be great models for and resources for other, to be applied to other primary sources, such as photographs. So.
Thank you so much for saying that. Yeah, there were some images that we didn't end up using. There was one depicting of slaves. It was actually a photograph of slaves picking cotton. And then the question was, who do you think had a heart? It was of African-American males, women, and children. And the question that I had was like, who do you think had a harder or more, had to work harder in the fields based off this imagery? And it was one of those images where, like, I don't think it's like a competition on who was working harder, but just like the fact of just how they do it. So I think to all your points that you guys were pointing out about primary sources and just the questions and just having to debunk it in the classroom, it's something that definitely needs more focus. But yeah, I'll definitely let Dr. Hefner know, like, an expansion of this. Thank you guys so much.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, Tony, I have a quick question too. Thank you for presenting all this. It was very interesting. And one of the things that kept running through my mind as you were going through this was the amount of PowerPoint presentations that I create for teaching one class every year, and then multiply that by 4 classes, and then every semester 4 classes, putting up images. And I wonder how the text, I wonder if your analysis could be brought into how instructors use images in the classroom, and if we can use your theory to show, or to maybe to see what kind of images PowerPoint presentations are presenting. Because in the textbook's one thing, but I'm wondering because the textbook, you move from that to your PowerPoint presentation, and it's almost like I'm always searching for images, and the amount of time that I have sometimes really doesn't give me the and I think this is my own shortcoming. I just don't have a lot of time to find and think through these images. So I'm almost wondering if just that time compression that I have almost accidentally, or just, oh, that image looks good, let me put that up there. If by doing that process, that's almost creating and furthering this kind of challenge even more, because we're finding images that through our Google search images that just rise to the top, but those could have some kind of negative impact. So I'm wondering if that's a direction you all think you might be interested in heading into.
Actually, we haven't discussed that, but that is a very interesting point that you bring up, because Dr. Hefner and we had done a presentation about Paul Ortiz's African-American Latinx History of the United States, and we did it through looking for visual sources based off the timeline that he had in there. And even with us, we had like challenges just finding primary sources that depict those parts of history in a positive light, or like weren't redundant of, like you said, of what you see in Google sources. So we ended up creating like this source collection of just images that could be used to apply to that timeline. And it was just like in this like big Google Drive that we had done. So that is like a great and valid point. And even like for myself, when I do presentations, it does become challenging of like what image to select because of the intentionality that has to be behind it. And then making sure that there's a deep, not a deep understanding, but an awareness of, okay, like, why is this image being used? Like, what is the context? And then I think it goes into the idea of students understanding like the historical perspective of images and understanding like how historians, when they're painting images, like their vantage point from that. So that's a really great point, but that's not something we had considered, but I'll definitely let her know that's something that we could possibly consider to do with it. Hopefully I answered your comment or / question.
Hi, I just wanted to comment really quick. I've only been out of high school for 2 years, and so the whole time you were talking, I was just having flashbacks to all the history books I saw. And everything you said is very true. Fortunately, I had my dad taught social studies, and then all the teachers I had looked like me, so they kept it real, and they were like, that's not what was really going on. And then I think for me, I struggled to appreciate Black History Month because everything that I see was always really, it was either slavery or who the Black heroes were. And so I do think that raises a really good point that you were talking about, because we don't always focus on everything that happened, just kind of the glorified stuff. So I really like your presentation. So thank you so much for pointing that out.
Thank you so much for that comment. And I don't want to hold up Dr. Heafner too much, but it's very interesting that you said that because I grew up in a very predominantly white town and my parents are immigrants from Jamaica. So we're first generation in the United States. So things that I know is because of my own kind of research that I've done on my own. And then growing up in the town that I did, we didn't talk about Black history at all. And if we did, it was very much of the selected heroes. But my dad was always very much into like Malcolm X and naturally like Marcus Garvey. So those are things that I did, but I vividly remember in high school, I decided to write, like I was like in this honor social studies course, and I decided to write a paper on Huey Newton, a revolutionary suicide. Like the book changed my life. And it was like the biggest like contention in my school that I was writing like an analysis, like just kind of doing a book report on this book, but just trying to bring a different point of American history or like Black history to the forefront. So thank you so much for that comment. I think it's very valid and it's troubling that that's what.
Have you guys looked at Terry Epstein's Interpreting National History?
Okay, so I know we cited their work, but I'm not sure if how much we have looked into it.
Okay, I recommend it as well. Basically what she found is just what Joy was talking about, that like, well, if you're in an all Black school, they may do a better job, but here's the book. I love hard copies if you can't get a guess from my background, but that when Black students are in like predominantly white places and 75% of the teaching force is white females, they tend not to trust the story that they're being told, right? Because the story that's been passed down is in their families is a different story, right? Whereas the white students tend to trust what they're being told, and that creates this dichotomy and this split. So it's a great book that gets much further into the analysis.
Thank you so much for that suggestion. Can you just say that I know interpreting as an American history, national history? Okay. All right, thank you.
Great discussion and contributions, everybody. Wonderful presentations. Thanks for, again, such thought-provoking material and hard work looking at it. We do have the next session, I believe starts at 11:55, so we've got just a couple minutes to transition.